The ship came out of faster than light. Travel with a shudder that rattled every bolt in its frame. Captain Alaros gripped the armrest of her command chair and watched through the main viewport as the stars stopped streaking and became still points of light again, and there, hanging in the blackness like a city made of glass and starlight, was Concord Station. It was bigger than anything humanity had ever built. The station stretched across hundreds of kilometers, a sprawling web of rings and towers and docking arms that glowed with soft light in every color Voss could name, and a few she could not. Ships of every shape moved around it like fish around a reef. Some were smooth and organic like living things. Others were sharp and geometric, built by minds that thought in straight lines and hard angles, and none of them looked like anything from Earth. Voss let out a slow breath. Well, she said to no one in particular, we're here. Behind her, Dr. Idris Offer leaned forward in his seat, his dark eyes wide with the kind of wonder that made him look 20 years younger. He was the chief xenolinguist aboard the UES Meridian, which was a fancy way of saying he was the person responsible for making sure humanity did not accidentally insult an alien species. In its first week among the stars, he had spent 30 years preparing for this moment. It's beautiful, he whispered. It's terrifying, said Lieutenant Commander Priya Chen from the navigation console. She was not wrong. The Galactic Concordance had been watching Earth for decades. Humanity had known about this for only the last 5 years, and ever since the Concordance had sent a formal invitation to join their alliance. Message had been simple, polite, and had caused every government on Earth to lose its collective mind for about 6 months before they finally agreed on a response. Now here they were, the youngest species ever invited to Concord Station. Over 4,000 alien civilizations had come before them, some of them hundreds of thousands of years old. Humanity, with his few thousand years of recorded history in its habit of setting things on fire, was the new kid walking into a school full of ancient scholars. The docking procedure took an hour. The Meridian was guided into a berth by automated systems that moved with a precision that made human technology look like it was held together with tape and hope. When the airlocks finally connected and the doors opened, a wave of air rolled into the ship. It smelled clean, almost too clean, with a faint sweetness underneath that Voss could not identify. Standing on the other side was their liaison. Ambassador Thelvan of the Sithari was tall, nearly 7 ft, with skin that looked like it was made of living crystal. Light moved beneath the surface of his body in slow shifting patterns, blues and whites and pale golds that pulsated gently like a heartbeat. His face was roughly humanoid, but smoother, with no nose and eyes that were large, deep, and the color of a winter sky. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, like water running over smooth stone. Captain Voss, he said, and the translation device clipped to his chest turned his words into perfect English. With only a slight delay, to you on behalf of the Galactic Concordance, I welcome humanity to Concord Station. We have waited a long time for this day. Voss shook his hand. His skin was cool and hard like polished quartz. Thank you, Ambassador. We're honored to be here. Thelvan led them through corridors that were wide enough to fit a dozen humans walking side by side. Walls seemed alive, shifting in color and texture as they walked, responding to some system Voss did not understand. They passed aliens of every description. Creatures with too many legs, beings that floated in anti-gravity fields. Something that looked like a cloud of golden dust that rearranged itself into a vaguely polite shape as they passed. None of them looked at the humans with hostility, but Voss noticed something else in their gazes. Curiosity, yes, but also something careful, something watchful, the way a person might look at a new animal in a zoo before deciding whether it was safe. The welcome banquet was held in a hall so vast that the ceiling was lost in a soft haze of light. Hundreds of species were gathered, seated or standing or hovering at tables designed to accommodate every body shape imaginable. The food was served on platforms that adjusted to each species' needs. For the humans, the plates held something that looked and tasted remarkably like roasted chicken, which Akefer found both impressive and slightly suspicious. Voss sat at the head of the human delegation, flanked by Akefer and Chen. Around them, the noise of the banquet was a symphony of clicks, hums, whistles, and deep vibrations that Voss could feel in her chest more than hear with her ears. Translation devices worked overtime, so turning the chaos into a murmur of polite conversation. It was during the second course that it happened. Akefer had been talking with a small furry delegate from a species called the Valisi. The creature was earnest and formal, explaining the proper way to address a concordance elder when it used a phrase that the translator rendered as one must always approach with the correct number of limbs extended. Akefer blinked. I'm sorry, the correct number. What happens if you extend the wrong number? The Valenci delegate tilted its head. It would be considered a grave insult. When the Morvathi delegation first arrived 8,000 years ago, their ambassador extended 7 limbs instead of 6. It took 200 years to repair relations. Akefer stared at the small creature for a moment, then he looked at Voss, then he looked back at the volley, and then he started laughing. It was not a polite, quiet laugh. Akefer laughed the way he always did, with his whole body, his head thrown back, his deep voice booming out in waves of pure, uncontrolled joy. It was the kind of laugh that was impossible not to respond to. Chen snorted into her drink. Voss tried to keep a straight face and failed completely. Within seconds, the entire human delegation was laughing, some of them wiping tears from their eyes, the sound rolling out across the banquet hall like thunder. And then the hall went silent, not the gradual silence of a room losing interest. This was instant, total. Every sound stopped. Every alien in the room turned to look at the humans. Voss felt the weight of 1,000 stares land on her like physical force, and the delegate had frozen in place, its fur standing straight up on its body. Across the hall, a tall being made of dark smoke seemed to pull itself inward, shrinking. A group of insectoid creatures at a nearby table had stopped moving entirely, their mandibles locked open. The translation devices throughout the room flickered and buzzed as if they could not process what they had just heard. Then a Cathari delegate, slender being with pale, almost translucent skin and large black eyes, made a sound like a broken bell and collapsed sideways out of its chair. 2 other Cathari rushed to help, their hands trembling. Voss stood up slowly. The laughter had died in her throat. What just happened? she said quietly. No one answered. The aliens were not looking at the humans the way they had before, with cautious curiosity, or they were looking at them with something much older and much deeper. They were afraid. The banquet ended within minutes. Telvan appeared at Voss's side and took her arm. With a grip that was gentle but insistent, he guided her away from the hall and into a smaller room, a private chamber with walls that dimmed to a soft gray as the door closed behind them. His crystalline skin had changed. The warm blues and golds were gone. He was pale, now almost colorless, and the light beneath his surface pulsed in quick, uneven patterns. Voss had spent enough time studying Satari body language to know what that meant. He was not just uncomfortable, he was deeply, genuinely frightened. Captain Voss, he said, and his voice was no longer smooth. There was a crack in it, a fracture in that careful calm. I must ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Of course, the sound your species just produced, the vocalization. What was it? Voss frowned. We were laughing. Thelvan repeated, as if testing the word for hidden edges. Yes, it's something humans do when something is funny, when something surprises us in a good way, or when something is absurd, or when we're happy. It's completely normal for us. Thelvan stared at her for a long time. The light in his skin dimmed further until he was nearly dark. Then he looked away and said nothing. Voss waited. She had commanded warships and negotiated peace treaties and stared down political enemies without blinking, but the silence in that room and the look on Thelban's face made something cold settle in her stomach. Ambassador, she said, what's wrong? I cannot explain tonight, he said finally, but I must ask you and your crew to return to your ship for now. I will come to you in the morning. Please trust me when I tell you that this is very important. Voss agreed. Because she had no other choice, she gathered her crew and walked back to the meridian through corridors that now felt very different. The aliens they passed did not watch them with curiosity anymore. They moved aside. They created distance. One species, a group of beings that looked like walking trees, physically turned away as the humans passed, pressing their bodies against the wall. Back on the ship, Voss sat alone in her quarters and opened the communication logs. Standard procedure after any diplomatic event was to check for any formal messages from the concordance. There was one message. It was flagged with a classification code that Voss had to look up in the concordance database they had been given. When she found it, she read the description 3 times to make sure she understood. Class 7 behavioral monitor applied to pre-war civilizations exhibiting signs of imminent destabilization or potential for mass violence. The galactic concordance, the time it had taken the humans to walk back to their ship, had classified them at the same threat level as civilizations on the edge of genocide. Because they had laughed, Voss closed the screen. She sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the hum of her ship around her, and tried to understand what kind of galaxy they had just walked into. Outside, Concord Station continued to turn slowly in the starlight, beautiful and vast, and suddenly deeply unfriendly. Orthovan did not come in the morning. He did not come for 3 days. During that time, the human delegation was confined to a section of Concord Station that included their docking berth, a small recreation area, and a viewing gallery that looked out over one Of the station's many garden rings, it was polite confinement. The food was excellent. The quarters were comfortable, but there were guards at every exit point, tall beings in dark armor that did not respond to conversation, and the corridors that had been open to the humans before were now sealed behind energy barriers that hummed softly when anyone got too close. Captain Voss handled it the way she handled most things. She kept her crew calm, maintained their routine, went in, and spent her private hours reading everything she could find in the Concordance cultural database they had been given access to. The database was enormous, a library that contained the recorded knowledge of over 4,000 civilizations spanning 200,000 years. Most of it was still locked behind clearance levels the humans did not have, but what was available was enough to keep Voss reading for days. Dr. Acapper took a different approach. He was looking for one specific thing. He sat in the small workspace the Concordance had provided, surrounded by holographic displays that floated in the air around him like glowing pages of a book. His fingers moved through the data with the speed of someone who had spent his entire life learning languages and the cultures that created them. He searched for references to laughter. He searched for descriptions of involuntary vocal responses to humor. He searched for any concept in any of 4,000 civilizations that matched what humans called being funny. He found nothing, not a single species in the entire recorded history of the Galactic Concordance had ever developed laughter. Not one in 200,000 years of galactic civilization across millions of worlds and billions of species that had risen and fallen. Nothing had ever laughed before. Acapper sat back in his chair and stared at the empty search results for a long time. Then he started looking at what the aliens did have instead. The Concordance database had extensive records on emotional expression across species. Every civilization that joined the Alliance submitted detailed studies of their psychology, their social behaviors, their ways of communicating, feeling. Acapper read through hundreds of them, then thousands, looking for patterns. The pattern he found was disturbing in its consistency. Among all known sapient species, emotional expression was linear and proportional. When a Sayer felt joy, the light in their crystalline skin increased in brightness. More joy meant more light, less joy meant less light. It was a straight line, a simple equation. The same was true for every other emotion. Pain produced distress signals that scaled with the intensity of the pain. Fear triggered retreat behaviors that grew stronger as the threat grew larger. Contentment produced calm, steady biological rhythms. Everything matched, everything was predictable. Input led to output in a clean, rational way that any scientist could model and any computer could predict. Human laughter broke every single one of these models. Acapper made a list of the things that made humans laugh, and the list itself was enough to give them a headache. Humans laughed when they were happy. They also laughed when they were nervous. They laughed when they were embarrassed. They laughed when they were in pain. They laughed at funerals. They laughed in war zones. They laughed when they were terrified. They laughed at things that were not funny at all. And they failed to laugh at things that should have been hilarious, and there was no reliable way to predict which response would happen. In any given situation, laughter was involuntary. It could not be fully Controlled, it was contagious, spreading from person to person in a way that bypassed rational thought entirely. It was acoustically complex, one combining elements of breathing, vocalization, and muscular contraction in a pattern that was unique among all known biological sounds, and most critically, it often occurred in direct response to danger, suffering, failure, and death. Akepper understood now why the aliens had been afraid. From their perspective, laughter must have looked like madness. On the fourth day, Thelvan finally returned. He arrived at the human quarters looking tired, which for Satari meant that the light in his skin moved sluggishly, and his normally smooth surface had developed faint hairline cracks along his arms and neck, stress fractures. Akaforni, the Cathari equivalent of dark circles under the eyes. Voss met him at the entrance. She did not waste time on pleasantries. Ambassador, my crew has been confined for 3 days without explanation. I think we deserve to know what's happening. You do. Thelvan agreed. He looked at her, then at Akafor, then at the rest of the human crew who had gathered behind them. May I sit down? This will take some time. They sat in the recreation area. Humans on one side, the alien ambassador on the other. Telling was quiet for a moment, gathering himself. Then he began. The Galactic Concordance has maintained peace for over 200,000 years. He said, in that time we have studied thousands of species. We have developed models that can predict the behavior of any civilization based on its biology, its psychology, its evolutionary history. These models are very accurate. They have allowed us to identify potential threats before they become dangerous and to guide young civilizations toward peaceful integration. He paused. Hey, your species broke our models in the first hour. Voss folded her arms. Because we laughed. Because you laughed. Thelvan confirmed. Captain, I want you to understand something. The Concordance has a classification system for behavioral phenomena. Every sound, every gesture, every social ritual that a species produces is cataloged and analyzed. We have tens of millions of entries in this catalog. Your laughter does not match any of them. It is, as far as the Concordance is concerned, entirely unprecedented. Akepper leaned forward. I've been looking through your database. I noticed the same thing. No species has ever developed anything like laughter. That is correct, and the reason is important. Thelvan's skin flickered. Among all known sapient species, emotional responses follow logical patterns. They are proportional, high predictable, and serve clear evolutionary functions. A distress call signals danger. A bonding tone signals safety. Every emotional expression can be understood as a rational response to a specific stimulus. And laughter isn't rational. Akepper said quietly. Laughter is the opposite of rational. It is involuntary, unpredictable, and it occurs in response to contradictory stimuli. Your species produces the same sound when it is happy, when it is afraid, when it is in pain, and when it witnesses suffering. The same vocalization serves as a social bonding mechanism, a stress response, a submission signal, and an aggression display. It does not follow any model we have. Thelvan looked at his hands. Light in them was very dim. The Concordance has a theoretical category for this kind of behavior. We call it a dissociative threat response. It describes a species whose neurology has been so deeply damaged by evolutionary trauma that its emotional processing has fractured. The signals have become crossed. Pain triggers pleasure, fear triggers joy, destruction triggers celebration. The room was very quiet. In our models, Thielvan continued, a species that exhibits dissociative threat response has been broken by its own evolution. It has been hurt so deeply for so long that its mind has shattered and reassembled itself in a way that allows it to function, but that makes it fundamentally unpredictable. Such a species cannot be deterred by pain because pain makes it laugh. It cannot be deterred by fear because fear makes it laugh. It cannot be deterred by the threat of death because death itself makes it laugh. He looked up at Voss. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Captain? In the eyes of the concordance, a species that laughs is a species that has learned to enjoy its own destruction, and a species that enjoys its own destruction cannot be controlled, cannot be predicted, and cannot be stopped. Voss sat very still. Around her, the crew of the Meridian was silent, their faces carrying a range of expressions from shock to something that might have been dark amusement, because that, of course, was exactly the kind of thing a human would find grimly funny. You think we're insane, Voss said flatly. I think your species has endured something that no other species in the galaxy has endured and survived. Delivan said, what? And there was something in his voice that was not quite fear and not quite pity, but something in between. Your planet is classified as a Category 12 Death World, Captain. That is the highest rating the Concordance assigns. Your world has subjected your species to predation, disease, natural disasters, ice ages, mass extinction events, and the constant threat of annihilation for millions of years. No other sapient species in our records evolved under such conditions. Most species that develop intelligence do so on stable, temperate worlds with predictable environments. And you think that's what broke us? Akeffer said, hesitated. The Concordance believes that your evolutionary history was so traumatic that your species developed laughter as a survival mechanism, a way to continue functioning, despite conditions that should have driven you to extinction. Your brains learn to convert horror into something bearable. It is from a purely clinical perspective remarkable, but it is also deeply alarming because you can't predict us, Voss said, because we cannot predict you. And in 200,000 years, Captain, we have been able to predict everyone. Another silence filled the room. Akepper watched the light move slowly through Thielvan's skin and thought about the look on the Cathari delegate's face just before it collapsed at the banquet. He thought about the way every alien in that hall had frozen when the humans laughed. He thought about 4,000 civilizations, ancient and powerful and wise, all united by one thing they had in common. They were all, every single one of them, ain't afraid of a sound they had never heard before. What happens now? Voss asked. Delvan's skin cracked a little more along his neck. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Overseer Raketh has called a special session of the full conclave. Every delegation has been summoned. This has not happened in over 6,000 years. What's the topic? Thelvin looked at her with those large pale eyes. In the last of the warmth drained from his crystalline skin, whether humanity should be permanently quarantined, he said, sealed in your home system, cut off from the rest of the galaxy. Forever, the word hung in the air like a held breath. Voss looked at her crew. She looked at Akefer, who met her eyes with a steadiness that she was grateful for. She looked at Chen, who had gone pale but whose jaw was set in a hard line. She looked at the rest of them, these strange, loud, laughing creatures from a death world who had somehow clawed their way to the stars only to be told that the stars were afraid of them. Then she looked back at Thelvan. When is the session? She asked. Tomorrow. Voss nodded once. She stood up, straightened her uniform, and took a breath. Then I suppose we'd better figure out how to explain a joke to 4,000 civilizations that have never heard one. Thelvan stared at her. You find this situation amusing? Voss smiled, and it was the kind of smile that did not reach her eyes, but that held something hard and unbreakable at its core. Ambassador, if I couldn't find this funny, I'd have to find it terrifying, and I think you've had enough terrified species for 1 week. Delvon said nothing, but as he turned to leave, Akefer could have sworn he saw the faintest flicker of something new in the alien's crystalline skin. Not fear, not pity, something that might in time become understanding. The great conclave chamber was the largest enclosed space Captain Alaros had ever seen. It was built in the shape of a vast bowl with thousands of platforms rising in tiers from a central floor, each one designed for a different species. Some platforms were filled with water, others burned with controlled fire. Some existed in pockets of different atmospheres, sealed behind shimmering energy fields that kept their occupants alive. The ceiling was so far above that it disappeared into a gentle glow like an artificial sky. 405 delegations were present. None of us knew this because the number was displayed on a floating marker near the entrance, updating in real time as the last few species took their positions. Each delegation represented civilization. Each civilization represented billions of lives. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. She stood on the central floor with Afer and Chen beside her, 3 humans in the middle of a room that held representatives from every known intelligent species in the galaxy. The floor beneath them was transparent, and through it Voss could see the stars turning slowly below the station. It was either beautiful or terrifying, and she had decided not to think about which. Overseer Reth of the Dravani presided over the session from a raised platform. Directly above the center, the Dravani were an insectoid species that operated as a hive mind, dozens of individual bodies sharing a single consciousness. Ruth was not one being but 37, all of them arranged in a precise formation on their platform, their dark carapaces clicking softly in unison as they moved. When the overseer spoke, all 37 mouths moved together, producing a layered voice that the translators rendered as something deep and resonant. This special session of the Galactic Conclave is called to order, the overseer said, and the chamber fell silent. The matter before us is the continued integration of the human species designation Sol 3 into the Galactic Concordance. Testimony will be heard. A vote will be taken. Let us begin. The first to speak were the Cathari. Their delegate rose from a platform near the top of the chamber. The Cathari were empaths, a species that perceived emotions as directly as humans perceived light or sound. Their bodies were slender and almost translucent, with large dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything around them. The delegate who spoke was the same one who had collapsed at the banquet, and Voss could see that. It was still visibly shaken. The Cathari spoke softly, and the translator carried its words to every corner of the chamber. We have studied the psychic signature of the human vocalization they call laughter. The delegate said it is unlike anything in our records. The emotional frequency is complex and contradictory. It contains elements of joy, fear, aggression, relief, and something we can only describe as defiance, all occurring simultaneously. In our experience, there is only one other known psychic signature that combines aggression and pleasure in this way. The delegate paused. The chamber waited. It is the signature we call battle ecstasy. It was found only in the crash, a predator species that existed 9,000 years ago. The crush experienced intense pleasure during acts of violence. They could not be reasoned with. They could not be deterred. Concordance was forced to act. The crash no longer exists. A ripple of movement passed through the chamber. Voss kept her face still, but she felt Akafer shift beside her. The Cathari continued. We do not say that humans are the crush, but we say that the psychic signature of their laughter is identical in structure to the crash battle state. We urge the conclave to consider what this means. The Cathari sat. Well, the next to speak were the Morvathi. The Morvathi were a silicon-based species that resembled tall pillars of dark, polished stone. They did not have faces in any way that humans would recognize. They communicated through vibrations that traveled through the floor and walls, which the translators picked up and converted to speech. The Morvathi were known throughout the concordance as the greatest analytical minds in the galaxy. They dealt in models, predictions, and probability. Their representative vibrated, and the translation came through flat and emotionless. We have run 742 predictive models on the human species based on the behavioral data collected during their arrival. In all models, a species that exhibits involuntary pleasure, responses to pain, danger, and death has a 0% probability of long-term peaceful coexistence with other civilizations. This is not an opinion. This is a mathematical certainty. The Morvathi paused, then continued. The reason is simple. Deterrence is the foundation of galactic peace. Species refrain from harmful action because those actions carry consequences that cause suffering. Species that convert suffering into pleasure cannot be deterred by consequences. It is by definition immune to the mechanisms that maintain peace. Such a species will inevitably become a threat. More movement in the chamber. Voss noticed that many of the alien delegations were leaning forward, nodding or making their species-specific gestures of agreement. The Morvathis numbers were clean and cold and convincing. 0%. That was not a number that left room for argument. 3 more species testified. A gaseous collective called the Nth described how human laughter had disrupted their chemical communication. For hours after the banquet, a species of tall, quiet beings called the Sorathi presented historical evidence that every species in the concordance's records that had developed unpredictable emotional responses had eventually become violent. A small insect-like race called the Vel simply stated that they were afraid of the humans and wished them to be removed. Through all of it, Voss stood still and listened. She had been a soldier before she was a captain, and she knew when a battle was going badly. The room was turning against them. She could feel it, not with the Cathars' empathic sense, but with the plain human instinct that came from years of reading people. The fear in this room was real, and it was growing. Finally, Overseer Reich turned its 37 bodies toward the center floor. The human delegation may now speak, the overseer said. Voss stepped forward. Transparent floor beneath her showed the stars. 4,000 civilizations looked down at her from every direction. She was aware in a way that she felt in her bones that the next few minutes might determine whether humanity would reach the stars or be locked away forever. She had prepared a speech. Akapper had helped her write it, full of careful diplomatic language and references to humanity's peaceful intentions and its desire for cooperation. It was a good speech. It was reasonable and logical, and exactly what the concordance would expect. She threw it away. I want to tell you a story, she said. The chamber was silent. In the year 2031, a human pilot named Yuki Tanaka was flying a test mission in low Earth orbit. She was alone in the spacecraft. 18 minutes into the flight, a micrometeorite struck her oxygen line. She had about 7 minutes of air left, and she was too far from any rescue. She knew she was going to die. Boss paused. She looked around the chamber at the thousands of alien eyes and sensors and receptors trained on her. Yuki Tanaka spent the first 2 minutes trying to fix the line. When she realized she could not, she spent the next minute contacting mission control to report the situation and transmit her flight data so it could be used to save future pilots. And then, with 4 minutes of air remaining, as she turned her camera to face the viewport, Voss took a breath. Outside her window was the Earth, the Pacific Ocean, the curve of the atmosphere, the light of the sun on the clouds. She looked at it for a long time, and then she laughed, not because she was happy, not because she was insane. She laughed because she was a human being looking at the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and she was about to die, and the only thing she could think to say was, Voss's voice was steady, but something in it had changed. Something had gotten through the armor. Her last words were, well, that's a hell of a view. The chamber was absolutely still. She died 4 minutes later, and when mission control released the recording, billions of people on Earth heard it. And do you know what they did? She looked up at the Cathari delegate. She looked at the Morvathi. She looked at the Vil, who were trembling on their platform. They laughed and they cried at the same time, because that is what laughter is. It is not madness. It is not bloodlust. It is a human being standing at the edge of the worst thing that can happen and choosing in that moment to find something beautiful in it, something worth smiling about, even if it is the last thing they ever do. Silence, deep, vast, galaxy-wide silence. Then Overseer spoke. The conclave thanks the human delegation for its testimony. The vote will now be taken. The voting was done through the platforms themselves. Each delegation registered its position, and the results were displayed in real time on a massive holographic counter that floated above the center of the chamber. Voss watched the numbers climb. For quarantine, 847 against quarantine 612, the gap widened. For 1,200 against 150, then it tightened. For 1588 against 1,573. Species after species cast their votes, and the two numbers climbed together, like runners in a race that neither could pull away from. When the count reached the final tallies, Voss had to read the numbers twice to be sure. For Quarantine 2011 against Quarantine 1994. The motion to quarantine humanity was winning, but not all delegations had voted. A small cluster of species, 17 in total, had abstained. Their platforms glowed with a neutral white light that stood out against the green and red of the decided votes. Overseer Rath addressed the abstaining delegations. The undecided parties have 26 standard hours to cast their votes. If no majority is reached, nor the motion be decided by the overseer's authority, this session is suspended. The chamber began to empty. The noise returned. Hundreds of species murmuring and clicking and vibrating to each other as they filed out. Voss stood on the transparent floor and watched the undecided platforms, their white lights steady and uncommitted. Occuper stepped up beside her. That was close, he said quietly. It's not over. No. He looked at the list of abstaining species displayed on the nearest screen. His finger stopped at one name, the Scythery. Abstained. Voss nodded. She had noticed Thelvan's delegation had not voted. He's afraid, Occuper said, but I don't think he's afraid of us. I think he's afraid of what it means if we're right. Voss looked at him. What do you mean? Occuper stared at the undecided platforms in those small points of white light in a sea of green and red, and something thoughtful moved behind his eyes. If laughter isn't madness, he said slowly, if it's actually something valuable, something useful, something that helps a species survive, then the concordance has to ask itself a very uncomfortable question, which is. Occuper turned to her, and his face was serious in a way she rarely saw. Why didn't any of them develop it? What does it mean that 4,000 civilizations in 200,000 years never learned to laugh? What did they lose by never needing to? And what is it costing them right now today that they don't even know about? Voss had no answer for that. But somewhere on Concord Station, in a private chamber, Ambassador Thelvan sat alone in the dark, with cracks spreading slowly across his crystalline skin, thinking the very same thing. It was the middle of the station's artificial night when Thelvan came to the human quarters. The quarters were dim, lit only by the soft bioluminescent strips that lined the floors, and the ambassador moved through them like a ghost. His crystalline skin was dark, giving off almost no light at all, and the cracks that had formed along his arms and neck had deepened. He looked, Occuper thought when he opened the door, like something that was slowly coming apart. Dr. Occuper, Thelvan said, I apologize for the hour. May I come in? Occuper stepped aside without a word. He had been awake anyway, sitting at his desk reviewing everything he could find about the 17 undecided delegations, trying to figure out which way they might vote and what arguments might reach them. But the moment he saw Thelvan's face, he closed his screens and gave the ambassador his full attention. They sat across from each other in the small common area of the human quarters. The rest of the crew was asleep. The ship hummed quietly around them. Through the viewport, the lights of Concord Station's garden ring turned slowly green and gold against the black. Thelvan did not speak for a long time. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, the cracked crystal of his fingers interlocked, and stared at the Floor Akepper waited. He had learned long ago that the most important conversation started with silence. Finally Thielban looked up. I need to understand, he said, before I cast my vote. I need to understand what laughter truly is, not the clinical description, not the behavioral classification. I need to understand it the way your species understands it. Akepper nodded. Slowly, I'll try. The conclave heard your captain's story about the dying pilot. It was moving, but it did not answer the question that keeps me awake. The pilot laughed because she was dying. How does a mind produce joy in the presence of death? Where does that response come from? Akepper leaned back in his chair and thought about how to explain something that was as natural to him as breathing to someone who had never taken a breath. Let me start at the beginning, he said. A long time ago, before humans had cities or language or tools, we were prey. We were small, slow, weak creatures living on a planet that was trying to kill us in every way imaginable. Predators hunted us. What diseases ravaged us? Weather froze us and burned us. Ground opened up and swallowed us. Every single day was a fight to survive. Thielban listened, his skin flickering faintly. Now most species that face that kind of pressure either adapted physically, growing bigger, faster, stronger, or they went extinct. Humans did something different. We adapted. Socially, we formed groups. We survived. Not because any individual was strong enough to fight a predator, but because we worked together. The group was everything. If you were alone, you died. If you were with your people, you had a chance. This is consistent with our records of your evolution, Thielban said. Right, but here's the part your records don't capture. Living in groups under constant threat creates a specific problem, stress, fear, trauma. If a group of early humans just survived a predator attack, if they watched one of their own get taken, if they spent hours running in terror through the dark, their bodies would be flooded with chemicals that cause pain, panic, and paralysis. If those chemicals stayed active, the group couldn't function. They couldn't hunt, they couldn't gather food, they couldn't protect their young. The stress would destroy them as surely as the predator would. Akepper leaned forward. So our bodies evolved a release valve after the danger passed. After the group survived, our neurology developed a mechanism that said, the threat is over, we are alive, we are together. And in that moment, the fear and the pain got converted into something else. The muscles relaxed, breathing changed, the voice produced a sound that was involuntary and contagious, so that when one person felt the release, everyone around them felt it too. At the same time, together. Laughter, Thielban said. Laughter, it was never about finding something funny, not at first. It was about surviving something terrible and telling your group through a sound that couldn't be faked or controlled that you were still alive and still together. It was a signal that said the worst has happened and we are still here. Thielban was very still. The cracks in his skin had stopped spreading, as if his body was listening as closely as his mind. Over millions of years it evolved, it became more complex. Humans started using laughter in new ways. We laughed at things that surprised us, so because surprise was linked to danger, and the laughter response helped our brains process it. We laughed at absurdity because recognizing when something didn't make sense was a survival skill. We developed humor, which is really just the art of setting Up an expectation and then breaking it, in a way that triggers that ancient release response and the dark humor. Your captain mentioned the laughter in the face of death. Akepper smiled in. There was something old and deep in that smile. That's the purest form of it. When a human laughs at death, they're not enjoying it, they're defying it. They're saying, you can take everything from me, but you cannot take this. You cannot take my ability to find something, anything, even in the worst moment of my life. That makes me feel connected to the people around me. That makes me feel alive. He paused. Laughter isn't a sign that we're broken, Ambassador. It's the reason we didn't break. Every other species on our planet that faced what we faced either grew armor or grew claws. We grew the ability to look at the darkness and refuse to let it consume us, not by ignoring it, not by pretending it wasn't there, but by transforming it into something we could carry together. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the ship. Delvon sat motionless, his large pale eyes fixed on Akepper's face. The light in his skin had begun to move again, slowly, in patterns Akepper had not seen before. Not the calm blues of contentment or the dim grays of fear. Something new. Something searching. There is something I have not told you, Thelvon said at last. His voice was different now. Oh. The diplomat's polish was gone. What remained was raw, unguarded, almost fragile. Something about my own people. Akepper said nothing. He just waited. 12,000 years ago, the Sithari home world experienced what we call the fracturing. A gravitational anomaly destabilized our star. Over the course of 3 centuries, our world was torn apart. Earthquakes, radiation storms, the slow, agonizing destruction of everything we had built. Billions died. Those who survived did so by retreating underground into crystalline caverns deep beneath the surface, where they waited for generations until the star stabilized. Thelvon's hands were trembling. The cracks in his skin glowed faintly, as if something beneath was trying to get out. We survived. We rebuilt. We joined the Concordance and became one of its most respected members, but the fracturing never left us. Among the Sithari, trauma is not merely psychological, it is physical. It is encoded in our crystalline structure and passed from generation to generation. Every Sithari alive today carries the fracturing within them. We feel it in our bones, in our skin, in the cracks that form when we are stressed or afraid. He held up his hands. The hairline fractures were visible even in the dim light, a web of tiny breaks running through crystal that should have been smooth and whole. These cracks, he said, they are not just from this week, they are from 12,000 years ago. They are the fracturing still echoing through my body, through every Sithari body. We carry it silently because we have no other choice. There is no mechanism in our biology to release it, no way to transform it. Yeah, no way to set it down. His voice cracked, and the sound was eerily similar to the tiny snapping sounds his skin made when the fractures deepened. For 12,000 years my people have endured. We have been strong. We have been stoic. We have been everything the Concordance values, and every single generation the cracks get a little deeper. Akepper felt something tighten in his chest. He looked at this ancient, beautiful, suffering being and understood with a clarity that took his breath away what he was really seeing. Not an alien ambassador, not a diplomat, a person carrying a wound so old and so deep that He had never even imagined it could be. Healed because he had never seen. Healing, not the kind that humans knew. Ambassador Akefer said gently. And how? Many species in the concordance carry. Something like this, Telvan looked at him. All of them, he said, every civilization that has endured long enough to reach the stars has survived. Something terrible, the Dravani lost half their hive in a plague that lasted 1,000 years. The Cathari were nearly destroyed by a psychic predator. Species that fed on their empathy. The Morvathi were shattered by a civil war that split their continental mind into fragments that took 10,000 years to reassemble. He spread his cracked hands. Every species in the station carries its trauma in silence. It is the way of things. It is what survival means. You endure, you continue, you do not look back, and you never heal, Akeper said. The words hung in the air between them. Felvan stared at him. And for the first time, my Akefer saw something in those pale alien eyes that was neither fear nor diplomatic composure. It was hunger. A deep, aching 12,000-year-old hunger for something the ambassador had never known existed until a group of strange, loud, fragile creatures from a death world had laughed at a dinner party. No, Tilvan whispered, we never heal. The silence that followed was the heaviest Akefer had ever experienced. He let it sit, he let it breathe, and then, very carefully, very gently, he asked the question that he knew was the reason Thelvan had come to him in the middle of the night. Would you like to learn? Thelvan's skin flared. For one bright, startling moment, his entire body lit up in a cascade of colors Akefer had never seen before. Whites and golds and deep, shimmering blues that raced through his crystal like lightning through a storm cloud. Then it faded and Thelvan was dim again, but the cracks on his hands had stopped spreading, just barely, just enough. Could you teach us? He asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. Could you teach a species that has never laughed how to laugh? Akeper thought about this. For a long time, he thought about the millions of years of evolution that had shaped the human brain, the ancient neural pathways that connected fear to relief to joy, the deep biological machinery that produced laughter without conscious thought. He thought about how hard it would be to teach something so instinctive, so fundamental to a mind that had never been built for it. Then he thought about a crystal in hand, cracked and trembling, reaching across 12,000 years of silent suffering to ask for help. I don't know, he said, honestly, but I know this much. On our world, there's a saying, laughter is the best medicine. It's old and it's simple, and most humans treat it like a cliché. But it's not, it's literally true. Laughter heals physically, chemically, neurologically. It reduces stress hormones, it strengthens immune systems, it repairs social bonds that trauma has broken. It works, Ambassador, it works. Because that's what it evolved to do. He reached across the table and very slowly placed his warm human hand over thence cold crystal. One, I can't promise I can teach you to laugh, but I can promise to try. And if there's one thing humans are good at, it's trying things that should be impossible and being too stubborn to stop. Thelvan looked at the human hand. On his, warm on cold, soft on hard, flesh on crystal, two species that could not have been more different, separated by biology and evolution, and 12,000 years of accumulated pain. And for the first time in his long life, Thelvan felt something he did not have a word For it was not joy exactly, it was not relief, it was smaller than that and more fragile and more precious. It was the first faint tremor of a crack. Beginning to heal, he stood. I must go. He said, the vote is in 12 hours. Ambassador Okafor said as Thelvan reached the door. Which way are you going to vote? Thelvan paused. The light in his skin was moving again, stronger now in those new patterns that Okafor could not read. I am going to do something I have never done before. Dr. Okafor, he said, I am going to take a risk. He left, the door closed behind him. Okafor sat alone in the quiet room and listened to the hum of the ship around him and thought about cracks and silence and the strain, stubborn, impossible human gift that might against all odds be exactly what the galaxy needed. Through the viewport, Concord Station turned in the starlight, and somewhere in its corridors, an ancient crystalline being walked toward a decision that would change everything, carrying within his cracked and aching body the first small spark of something that felt, if he was brave enough to name it, like hope. The great conclave chamber was full again, every platform occupied, every delegation present, at every eye and sensor and receptor focused on the central floor, where the undecided votes would be cast. The holographic counter floated above, showing the frozen tallies from the day before for quarantine 2011 against 1,994. 17 delegations still uncommitted. 17 points of white light in a sea of red and green. Captain Voss stood on the transparent floor with her crew behind her. She had not slept. None of them had. Okafor stood at her right shoulder, steady and calm, his dark eyes moving across the chamber with the careful attention of a man who understood that the next hour would decide the future of his species. Overseer Reich called the session to order. The 37 bodies of the Dravani hive moved in unison, and the layered voice filled the chamber. The undecided delegations will now cast their votes. Each may speak before voting if they wish. The first 6 delegations voted quickly without speeches. 3 voted for quarantine. 3 voted against. The counter shifted. For 2014 against 1,997. The gap held. 4 more delegations voted 2 and 2. The numbers climbed together. For 2016 against 1,999. 7 delegations remained undecided. Then a species Voss did not recognize, a group of beings that looked like floating ribbons of silver light, voted against quarantine and gave a brief statement that the translator rendered. As we were once feared, we remember what it cost us. We will not do the same to another. For 2016 against 2,005. Delegations left. 3 voted for, 1 voted against. The counter updated for 2019 against 2001. 1 delegation remained. The Sithari, the chamber, became so quiet that Voss could hear the hum of the energy fields around the atmospheric platforms high above. Every being in the room turned toward the Sithari platform where Thelvan stood alone. His crystalline skin was dark, the cracks visible even from a distance, web of fractures that covered his arms and neck and face. He looked ancient and fragile, and Voss thought absolutely terrified, but he was standing, and he stepped forward to the edge of his platform and he spoke. I have served the Concordance for 300 years, he said. His voice was quiet, but the chamber's acoustics carried it to every corner. In that time, I have helped negotiate 47 Treaties, I have mediated 12 territorial disputes. I have been present for the integration of 6 new species into our alliance. In all of that time I have never once questioned the wisdom of the concordance. Until now the chamber stirred. Thelvan continued. We have heard testimony that human laughter is dangerous, that it matches the psychic signature of extinct predator species, that it breaks our predictive models, that a species which laughs at death cannot be controlled. All of this is true. I do not dispute the data. I do not challenge the models. He paused, and the light in his skin flickered like a candle in a draft. Instead, I want to ask this conclave a question that I believe none of us has ever thought to ask, not in 200,000 years. He looked out across the vast chamber at the thousands of delegations, the countless species that had built the greatest alliance the galaxy had ever known. What has our silence cost us? No one moved. Concordance has maintained peace for 200,000 years. This is our greatest achievement, and I honor it. But peace is not the same as wholeness. Survival is not the same as healing, and I stand before you today with the cracks of a 12,000-year-old catastrophe running through my body to tell you something that I have never told anyone outside my own species. His voice trembled in the sound of it. The raw, unguarded vulnerability sent a visible ripple through the chamber. The Cathari delegates leaned forward. The Morvathi pillars vibrated at a lower frequency. Even the Dravani overseer went still. My people carry our trauma in our bones. It is encoded in our crystal. It passes from parent to child, generation after generation, and every generation it would grows heavier. We have no way to release it. We have no mechanism to transform it. We endure because endurance is all we know. He held up his cracked hands for the chamber to see. And we are not alone. Every species in this room carries its own wounds. The Dravani carry their plague. The Cathari carry the scars of the hollow ones who fed upon their empathy. The Morvathi carry the memory of their shattered mind. We all carry something, and we carry it in silence, because silence is what the concordance taught us. Be calm, be rational, be predictable, and never ever let the pain show. He lowered his hands. For 200,000 years that has been enough. But I look around this chamber and I see the cracks, not just in my own skin, in all of us, in the Dravani's rigid formations that grow more brittle with each century, in the Cathari's increasing sensitivity that makes them collapse at the first unexpected emotion, in the Morvathi's models that grow more desperate to predict everything because they cannot bear the memory of the one time they failed to predict themselves. His voice steadied. Something was changing in him. The fear was still there, but beneath it something else was rising, something that burned brighter than the fear. We looked at humanity and saw madness. We heard their laughter and heard the echo of the crash. We ran our models and found 0% probability of peaceful coexistence, and all of that analysis was based on a single assumption, that the way we have always done things is the right way, that silence is strength, that control is safety, that the absence of laughter is a sign of healthy civilization. He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the chamber with a clarity that made even the ancient overseer turn, all 37 heads toward him. But what if we were wrong? What if the silence that we call peace is actually a wound that we have been too afraid to name. What if the control that we call wisdom is actually a cave that we built for ourselves because we did not know there was any other way? And what if this strange, loud, terrifying species from a death world has stumbled upon the one thing that all our knowledge and all our centuries could never give us? He looked down at the central floor at Captain Voss and her small crew of fragile, warm, breakable humans, a way to face the darkness and choose together not to be consumed by it. The chamber was utterly silent, not the tense silence of fear, a different kind, the silence of 4,000 civilizations hearing something true for the first time. I do not know if humanity's laughter is safe, Theovan said. I do not know if it is wise to let them stay. I know only that for 300 years I have watched the concordance maintain peace, and I have watched the cracks grow deeper, and I have never once seen anyone offer a way to heal them, until a human being looked me in the eye and said, "Would you like to learn?" He straightened. The cracks in his skin were still there, deep and visible, but the light beneath him was stronger now than Voss had ever seen it, not the calm, diplomatic glow of a Scytherian control, something wilder, something braver. "When I vote against quarantine," he said, "and I do so not because I am certain it is safe, but because I am certain that our silence is killing us, and I would rather take a risk on hope than continue to die quietly in the dark." He stepped back. The chamber erupted, not in violence, not in anger, in something that had no name in any concordance language, but that humans would have recognized instantly. It was the sound of 4,000 civilizations, suddenly, painfully, beautifully confronting the truth they had been carrying in silence for longer than most of them could remember. The Dravani clicked in chaotic, broken patterns that shattered their usual precision. Cathari wept openly, their translucent bodies shaking with waves of emotion that spilled out and washed over the entire chamber. When even the Morvathi vibrated at frequencies they had never produced before, their stone surfaces ringing like bells, the remaining undecided delegations cast their votes. Every single one voted against quarantine. The final count glowed on the holographic display for quarantine 2019 against quarantine 2012, and then the undecided votes registered and the numbers shifted one final time for quarantine 2019 against quarantine 2019. A tie. The chamber fell silent again. Overseer rose. In the event of a tied vote, the overseer's authority decides the matter. 37 insectoid bodies turned toward the central floor. 37 pairs of compound eyes looked at Captain Voss. "Humanity may stay," the overseer said, and then in a voice so quiet that only those near us could hear, "Teach us." 50 years passed. The galaxy changed in ways that no model had predicted, because the models had never accounted for laughter. Human laughter ambassadors were stationed on over 200 worlds. They were not diplomats in any traditional sense. They were therapists, teachers, comedians, storytellers. They were people whose job was to sit with ancient, wounded civilizations and do the simplest, hardest, most human thing imaginable: help them learn to laugh. It did not happen quickly. The Morvathi took 11 years to produce their first laugh. Deep grinding vibration that cracked one of their stone surfaces and sent the human teacher running for cover before realizing that the sound was joyful, not Destructive, the Morvathi typically. Reserved and analytical, requested 3. More laughter teachers the following. Weak. Watch the Dravani hive mind was different when one of their 37 bodies learned to laugh, all 37 laughed. Simultaneously, the sound was so loud and so strained that it set off seismic alarms across an entire section of Concord Station. The Dravani apologized formally, then they did it. Again, the Cathari who had once collapsed in terror at the psychic signature of human laughter became its most devoted students. They discovered that laughter, when experienced from the inside rather than observed from the outside, was not the same as battle ecstasy at all. It was its opposite. It was the release of tension, not its accumulation, the letting go of pain, not its embrace. The Cathari published a study that was read by every species in the Concordance. Its title roughly translated, when was the sound we feared was the sound we needed, on the Cathari home world, deep in the crystalline caverns where their ancestors had once sheltered from the fracturing. A generation of young Cathari gathered in circles and tried to laugh. Their attempts were awkward and strange, more like the sound of ice breaking than anything a human would recognize. But when they did it together, in groups, their crystalline bodies resonated with each other, and the sound became something beautiful, a shimmering, ringing chorus that echoed through the caverns, and for the first time in 12,000 years began to fill the cracks. And on Concord Station, on a quiet evening, 50 years after the vote that changed everything, an old woman sat on a bench on the observation deck and waited for a friend. Captain Aravas, long retired. Amri looked thinner than she once had. Her hair was white and her hands were spotted with age, and she walked with a cane that she pretended she did not need, but her eyes were the same, sharp and warm and full of the kind of humor that time could not diminish. Thelvan arrived slowly. He was old too by Scythery standards, his crystalline skin clouded in places, the light within him dimmer than it had been half a century ago, but the cracks that had once covered his body had changed. They were still there, faint lines running through his crystal, but they no longer looked like damage. They looked like the veins of gold that ran through ancient stone, the marks of something broken that had been made whole in a way that was more beautiful than the original. He sat beside her. For a while they said nothing, and just watching the stars turn beyond the viewport. I have something for you, Voss said finally. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small data chip. It's a collection of every terrible joke offer ever told. He recorded them before he retired last year. Said you'd appreciate them. Thelvan took the chip and held it in his translucent fingers. Dr. Okafor's jokes were never funny. I know that's what made them funny. Thelvan considered this. His skin flickered and then slowly, imperfectly, with a sound like wind chimes caught in a storm, he laughed. It was not a human laugh. It was broken and strange and crystalline, a sound that no other species in the galaxy had ever produced before. A human had shown them how. It cracked and rang and shimmered in the air of the observation deck, and it was without question the worst laugh Voss had ever heard. She grinned. That's terrible. Thelvan's skin glowed brighter than it had in years, light racing through the golden cracks of his crystal in patterns that were wild and uncontrolled and utterly new. Then why are you smiling? Voss looked at her old friend, this ancient, cracked, luminous being who had once been so afraid of a sound that he had nearly voted to lock an entire species away. She looked at the golden light running through his scars, and she felt something rise in her own chest, something warm and old and unbreakable. Because it means you're going to be okay, she said, outside the viewport. The galaxy turned, conquered station, hung in the darkness, glowing with the light of 4,000 civilizations, and from somewhere deep within its corridors, carried by the station's acoustic systems and amplified by the resonance of crystal and kitten and stone and 100 other materials that had never been designed for this purpose, came a sound. It was laughter, clumsy and strange and imperfect, produced by beings who had never evolved the capacity for it, but who had learned it anyway, taught by a species that had been forged in fire and darkness and had emerged carrying the one gift the galaxy never knew it was missing: the sound of creatures who had stared into the worst the universe could offer and had chosen, despite everything, to find joy. It echoed through the station, it rippled out into the dark, and the galaxy, ancient and vast and wounded, began slowly at last to heal.